December weekend. Good. Friends, we are going to start. I believe that we are streaming. So for those of you who are home, welcome. For those who are watching us from different places, and thank you for being with us. We've had a little bit of a break, but we've also had a big weekend this last weekend. And I'm really delighted to be here with you. And I'm delighted to be here with you, especially on this special weekend, and to offer for us something of a special session, but a session that will lead us into the next segment of our learning together. And a session that in certain ways relates to a subject that is beyond the subjects that we have spoken about. So are you okay hearing me? You can't hear me? Oh, you can hear me? Okay. Okay. This is better? Okay. So we are going to move on to our next subject. And we're going to move to the next subject gingerly. We're going to hold a special session today, and we're going to think about what this session means as we move on to the next subject. And I'm going to ask us to start thinking, as we move on to the next subject, what are the key moments, the core moments, theologically, of our Judaism? What are the constitutive moments of our Jewish identity? I'm going to ask that we think about this question before we even start. And as we think about this question, we are going to be moving towards today and beyond today into the next sessions. And at the end of the session today, I'm going to re-ask this very same question. What are the constitutive moments, the most important moments of our Judaism theologically, right? And then we're going to start thinking about how they are represented in our liturgy and what it is that we make of them in the context of our liturgy, okay? And we're going to move on that basis towards the next section, as it were, or the next subject that we're going to be addressing. So this is how we're going to move forward. This is what we're going to be doing, and I'm delighted to be doing this with you. I'm thrilled to be doing this with you, and I'm thrilled to today be doing something a little bit special that relates to this whole Silver Weekend that we've been having. So let's start as we always do with a review, and then move forward. And I am going to offer you my apologies in advance. This is going to be a slightly shorter session than normal, because we have another event taking place this afternoon for the museum, followed by yet another event. So one event with Laura Roebuck, our artist whose work is presented in the social hall and atrium, and then yet another event in the afternoon that relates to Warhol and Gershwin. So we have many events coming up today, so I'm going to have to end a little bit early. So if necessary, I will speak faster. Here is what we have always been looking at, what we've been thinking about and looking at. These are the questions that we're asking of ourselves, and I'm going to ask us to really think about, again, questions 5 and 6 today, what it is that we do with questions 5 and 6, especially today, and especially in the context of the Silver Weekend. And I'm going to ask us to really consider them, because we are moving to a contemporary subject that is not just contemporary, but is anchored in antiquity. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let's do that, and let's go through a little bit of a review. And the review really relates to what we have been looking at over the past 4 sessions or so, 4.5 sessions, with regard to the Shema. So let's talk about the Shema yet again. That was where we left off. Remember, we did this whole study of the Shema. we introduced ourselves to the Shema. And I want to, for a moment, reflect upon the Shema and summarize what we said with regard to the Shema. First of all, we have learned and we have seen that the Shema language, all paragraphs of the Shema, contain both concepts and practices that already appear in other cultures in the Middle East from the second millennium before the Common Era all the way to the first millennium before the Common Era, including Hittite treaties, Assyrian treaties, other material that present the very same concepts as the very concepts that we learn about in the Shema. And they include the notion of loyalty, allegiance, and love. They include the notion of teaching and transmission to children. These ideas include the notion of the preservation of the document itself, right? Preserving the document itself, as we do, in the context of the mezuzah. The notion of ambassadorship, in other words, in the house and beyond the house, in the city and beyond the city, representing that notion of allegiance, right? And the notions of blessings and curses, the implications of keeping the Pledge of Allegiance or of not keeping this Pledge of Allegiance. What would happen if we did, we would be blessed. If we didn't, we would be cursed. All of these ideas are present in other texts of the ancient Near East and in our Shema, in the 3 paragraphs of the Shema. So the Shema isn't a direct copy of anything that occurs anywhere else in the ancient Near East. It is not a direct lifting, if you like, or appropriation of another Pledge of Allegiance or another piece of liturgy from another culture. That's not what we're seeing. But what we are seeing is an example of what scholars have called mimesis, or, in other words, an acculturation of ideas that then are Judaized. They're turned into part of Judean culture. And what happens with the Shema, as we have seen, it becomes the Judean statement. And we're going to talk about how this happens for a moment in summary. It becomes the Judean Pledge of Allegiance. And a Judean Pledge of Allegiance that is especially important because it allows us to maintain a sense of identity that is distinct, that is sufficiently different from the other pledges of allegiance of those other cultures, but at the same time also is familiar. Where is the familiarity? The familiarity, and we spoke about this, relates to the notion of sovereign deity. And the difference is a difference in language, in culture, and in the notion of that sovereign deity not being a king, queen, or emperor. In other words, not being associated with a living being or with human government. This, my friends, is magic. In this respect, and I want to really emphasize this, the Shema encapsulates the birth of Judaism through Judean culture. Not necessarily that the Judean authors of the Shema knew it, but that was what they started. Not only Judean identity, but what would become the beginning of Jewish culture. But the strength of the Shema doesn't only relate to what it contains, it also relates to what it omits, to what it does not contain, to what is absent from the Shema, as we have seen. Let's talk about what's absent from the Shema for a moment. Does the Shema mention the temple? The priesthood? Sacrifices? Does the Shema mention the laws of kashrut? Does it mention any kind of ritual along the kinds of rituals that we learn of in the book of Exodus and Leviticus? And do we learn the laws of cleanliness through the Shema? Do we learn a whole number of other rituals? No. Does the Shema mention specifically the land of Israel, Zion, Jerusalem? No. In other words, the Shema becomes a universal pledge that holds both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. That holds both when there is a priesthood and when there isn't a priesthood. When there are sacrifices and when there are no sacrifices. The genius of the Shema is not only, therefore, in what it contains, but in what it omits. And therefore in the universality of it, in part through the omission. Yes? And we started speaking about this, and I hope that by now this sounds familiar and you understand it. And this is one of the reasons, as we said in the previous sessions, that we understand the Shema to be a product of that moment of destruction leading to exile. And the experience of no sacrifices, no priesthood, no temple, no Jerusalem, and the need to maintain Judean identity. This is what the Shema is about, maintaining who we are. Yes, Judy. Forgive me, Judy, you're absolutely right. I shouldn't have used the acronym. Judy is asking, what does ANE stands for? And ANE, the acronym, stands for Ancient Near East. Ancient Near East. Forgive me for using the acronym, and thank you for pointing it out. I appreciate it. Okay? So we talked about the absence. Then we talked about some of the symbols that relate to the Shema. We didn't talk about all of them. We didn't talk about the phylacteries, and we didn't talk about the mezuzah. We didn't talk about the tefillin. We didn't talk about the mezuzah because I knew we wouldn't have the time to really study them in detail. This is something that if we do have the time, I will go back to. But we did talk about the tzitzit. And we spoke about the tzitzit yet again in the ancient Near Eastern context, and we talked about it as being a status symbol. And we looked at it in terms of images from other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and we even looked at a little bit of ancient Greek literature, and saw it yet again as a status symbol. And we, through the tzitzit, emphasized yet another element of the Shema. And the other element of the Shema is the most revolutionary aspect of Deuteronomic literature. The democratizing drive of Deuteronomic literature. What do we have to think about when we are in exile? What do we have to think about when there is no temple? When there is no priesthood? What do we have to think about? How do we maintain our identity without intermediaries, without those religious leaders who connect us with God, who officiate the rituals, the sacrifices, who are in charge, who lead us? And what does the Shema say to us? We are in charge. It is up to us to teach our children. It is up to us to maintain the words of God on our minds and on our hearts, on our arms, on our doorposts, to be the ambassadors. It is up to us. In other words, what does the Shema effectively demand of us? the privatization of Judaism. The removal of Judaism from the temple onto the home. The transfer of Judaism to each and every person, to each and every parent, to each and every grandparent, to each and every teacher, to each and every adult who's going to be out there in their homes and at work and in the field, in town and out of town. In this respect, the Shema, yet again, is not only the birth of Judaism, but is seen by the rabbis as anticipating post-Second Temple Judaism. And giving rise to a Judaism that is going to be able to survive in the diaspora. So the Shema in and of itself is enormously significant and, in fact, as we have said, revolutionary. But its inclusion in the liturgy and turning it into a central part of the liturgy was a strategic choice made by the rabbis. And it was made by the rabbis with a view to now a Jewish survival in the age of the diaspora, following the destruction of the temple. In many ways, that would become an experience that allowed the rabbis to recall the destruction of Israel and eventually the destruction of the first temple, and the background against which the Deuteronomist composed the Shema to begin with. In other words, we think about history, Jewish history, rabbinic history, secular history, as being progressive, as advancing, as moving forward. And in putting together Jewish liturgy, the rabbis suddenly come to the realization and recognize, as Professor Yerushalmi of Columbia University pointed out, that Jewish history is not only progressive, it is also cyclical. What happened before the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, the exile, could and did happen again. What had happened can again happen. And so, what we now understand is that in this respect, in the context of an understanding of what had happened, of exile, of destruction, of a lack of access to temple, to priesthood, to the rituals we were familiar with, the Shema becomes timeless. And what is our challenge? And what is the challenge of our liturgy? To speak, to utter timeless words in ways that are going to connect to our own circumstances and to our own conditions here and now. Which leads us to the special session that we're holding today. And now, following this review, I think we are able to summarize and to come to our session today with a sense of the uniqueness and the genius of the Shema. Yes? Any last questions about the Shema before we move on? Anything else that we might want to address that I didn't cover? Any questions that come up? Lynn, please. Wonderful question. Thank you. I'm going to repeat the question so that the people back home can hear the question. Excellent question. Lynn, you are absolutely right. What I pointed out was that there are a number of international treaties, including a treaty by the Assyrian Emperor Ashurbanipal on behalf of the Assyrian Emperor Ashurbanipal, whom we're not going to go into that yet again, but on behalf of that emperor, a treaty that was made by the Assyrian Empire for vassal kings to sign, and that we found in a number of palaces, including a palace in Syria. And by the way, we found a listing of the vassal kings who had to sign on to this Pledge of Allegiance. And among the vassal kings, as we had said, who had to sign it, was also Menashe, who is listed in the Hebrew Bible as our king. In other words, we know that they were familiar with the document, they had to sign it. Right? So we know that they had access to that document. In the 8th century before the Common Era. And that document contains many of the ideas that occur in the Shema, as we have seen, right? And the question that Lynn is asking is, how did these ideas make their way from that treaty, that Pledge of Allegiance, to our Shema? How did this happen? Right? This is what we call mimesis. There are ideas that are in the culture that everybody's talking about, right? And that make their way into our consciousness. And it doesn't mean that a document is copied word for word, but it means that the ideas are so influential that they become synonymous with the notion of a Pledge of Allegiance, with a notion of an assertion of identity. Right? And so when the Deuteronomist comes to formulate now a Judean Pledge of Allegiance that would be distinct from the Assyrian treaty, what do they lean on? What kind of language, what kind of ideas, what kind of concept do they draw from? Familiar pledges of allegiance. Familiar statements of what it means to be a member of the largest empire in the world. Except ours is going to be timeless. And ours is going to be governed by God, not flesh and blood. And ours is going to be the non-Assyrian Pledge of Allegiance. Right? Magic. Yes? Please.
It's very interesting because you keep referring to the Deuteronomist and stuff that was written way past is incorporated in the scrolls ascribed to Moses. Now I know that there's no timeline involved, but it's still, how do you get stuff that was written way past into the Holy Scrolls?
So we're asking a really interesting question. Thank you. The question is a question of chronology. And actually, if you read our Hebrew Bible, and I'm going to not address this fully right now, but I will look for you and I'm going to see whether we can talk about this a little bit later, I will show you the place in the Hebrew Bible where there is a description of the discovery of the book of Deuteronomy in the 8th century before the Common Era. Which means that before that, there were 4 books of the Pentateuch. There were 4 books of the Torah, not a 5th. Deuteronomy was not yet there. And it is only in the 8th century before the Common Era that suddenly Deuteronomy is discovered. Right? So you're absolutely right. There's a chronological question. We have to ask ourselves the chronological question, and we have to understand that the material that is in Deuteronomy, some of which is very old, some of which is much older than 8th century before the Common Era, is also redacted later on. Right? And we're going to talk about that further, and I addressed this in some of our sessions, but I am going to look for you, and we're going to talk about this at greater length. Thank you. Wonderful question. Yes, last question, then we move on. Yes, Candy. So, Candy, thank you for asking this question. Thank you. We did talk about this. Thank you for, for adding this to our summary. We did discuss this. The question for the sake of people at home is, why does I'm going to rephrase the question. The Shema has 3 full paragraphs. 2 of them from the book of Deuteronomy, 1 of them from the book of Numbers. We saw the paragraphs, we read the paragraphs, we know. Why did the Reform movement truncate the Shema and remove some of the language of these 3 paragraphs, especially paragraphs 2 and 3? Why was the language removed? And why do we not utter the entire Shema? And we spoke about this a little bit. And we spoke about the discomfort with the notion of blessings and curses, right? And we also spoke about the discomfort with associating the Shema with specific rituals like wearing a talit in the modern age, right? That this isn't what Judaism is really about. Judaism is about how we feel, how we identify, how we carry ourselves, how we act, and not so much what we wear, right? The whole Reform sensibility with regard to that through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? And of course, we know that in the late 20th century and early 21st century, we are returning to greater ritual, right? And who knows, all of this may change. We may rethink our liturgy and the way we recite the Shema, right? Yes?
Yes.
Does this help?
Yeah. I think that if we're going to talk about the importance of the Shema and those words to us, we have to bring in the philosophy of those words and not just the history. And I realize that you're relating the history of it to us, but after many, many years of trying to figure out what those words, those few simple words mean, I think that we need to talk a little bit about the philosophy, about the unity of Judaism, about the unity of God and Jews and the wholeness and what it means to be one. And we haven't mentioned that at all.
So, Candy, let me repeat the question again for people back home, your comment for people back home. What you're looking at, what you're asking for, in a sense, is the kind of divrei Torah that we offer here from the pulpit, right? And the notion of the meaning of the Shema, and the meaning in terms of the unity that is presented in the Shema, and the notion of our connection with God. And what does that mean in terms of Jewish identity? And much of what I'm offering here is the foundation upon which all of that is constructed. Where does it come from? Right? And that, of course, and when I talk about the Jewish Pledge of Allegiance, and when I talk about Jewish identity, and when I talk about the timelessness of the Shema, of course, that's what I'm talking about, right? So, and what we're trying to focus on here is really where does it come from, and how did we get here, and why are we even saying it, right? How did it find its way into our liturgy, right? Okay. Are we ready to move on? Is that okay? I'm going to do this relatively quickly. Yes.
Certainly get a question about philosophical meaning of Lord the Shema. Isn't it appropriate time to explore what is secret? The document which was written by King of Syria died when it became document which is belonged in part to Judaism. And it did not only didn't die, but different modern organizations, political structures are trying to utilize. What is the secret?
So,
It is very simple, by the way.
well,
The explanation is very simple.
Michael, let me repeat the question for people back home. In brief, the question that Michael is asking is, what is sacred? But not only what is sacred, but what renders the Shema sacred. And what renders the Shema sacred more than the documents that precede the Shema, upon which the Shema is constructed or from which the Shema, in a sense, is inspired or drawn. Great question. Not so easy to answer. Many scholars have written about this, right? But what we are clear on is that for us, and in our minds and in our liturgy, it is sacred, right? And this is something that we will get back to. This is a question of what is sacred, right? Which we're going to get back to. By the way, for those of you who don't know and who have a pen and paper or who are able to write something down, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there was a scholar by the name of Rudolf Otto, who was a philosopher and anthropologist of religion, who wrote a book in German called Das Heilige, that was translated into English. And the title of the book in English is On Holiness, or On the Sacred. And what Rudolf Otto launched was an entire field of study about the notion of the sacred, raising with us the whole idea of the numinous. And one of these days, we will get to talk about it, but not right now. But if you guys want, the book is widely available. It is relatively short. It is packed with information. It is inspiring, and it's a wonderful read. So now we're going to talk a little bit about redemption. And I'm going to start out talking about redemption, thinking back to our prayer book, and thinking about this weekend that we're celebrating, and going completely out of order, but in a way that will make sense in sessions to come, and trying to think with you through one element of the prayer that we utter in our Mishkan Tefillah for the state of Israel. Since this Silver Scholar weekend was all about the founding of Israel, let's take a look at the prayer for Israel, and let's take a look at one element of it, and from that element move on to redemption. Here is what Mishkan Tefillah, our prayer book, says, right? Heavenly One, I outlined the words here. You're going to see that some words are outlined. The words that are outlined are words wherein the translation does not match the Hebrew. Okay? In Hebrew, it actually says Heavenly Father or Heavenly Parent. Here, in order to avoid the gender morass, Mishkan Tefillah says Heavenly One, but it really ought to say Heavenly Parent or Avinu Shebashamayim, actually in Hebrew, Heavenly Father, right? I accept not saying Father. I think parent would be better, but that's what it says in the Hebrew, in Mishkan Tefillah, which is translated into Heavenly One, all right? Protector and Redeemer of Israel, right? In Hebrew, Tzur Yisrael Vegoalo. Tzur Yisrael, the rock of Israel. Not just protector, rock of Israel. And we're going to look at that notion of protector and rock today. And that notion of protector and redeemer at the same time. Right? That's what we're going to look at today. Bless the state of Israel. And now, which marks the dawn, marks the dawning of hope. In Hebrew, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. The start, the beginning of the growth, of the rise of our redemption. This is what our Mishkan Tefillah says. For all who seek peace, which doesn't exist in the Hebrew. Is it interesting? Right? Have you ever thought about this? Right? Not in the Hebrew. Shield it beneath the wings of your love. Shield Israel beneath the wings of your love. Spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise. In Hebrew, all who lead, govern in Israel. Not all who lead and advise in general, but all who govern in Israel. To all of its people who lead and advise, guiding them with your, this ought to be a you, forgive the misspelling, good counsel, establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Amen. Do you see the differences between the English and the Hebrew? Yes? It's fascinating. Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Not quite right now. We're going to come back to many of the elements of it. I just want to point out, by way of introduction, the translation and the Hebrew are not quite the same. And there's a reason for that. We want to read it one way. The Hebrew, is a different story, and maybe for a slightly different audience. Yes? Okay? So far, so good? So one of the things I want to look at with you here is the notion of rock and redeemer of Israel and where it comes from. And I want to talk to you today and to introduce you today to the religious value of Israel. To Israel being something that is in our liturgy. The establishment, the founding of the State of Israel in our liturgy. As something that we give thanks for, as something that we pray about. What is it doing there? Why is it there? What is the religious value of Israel? And why are we praying for it? What is it that we pray for? Right? In other words, the language of God, the language of God's protection, the language of redemption are all in this piece of liturgy that relate to the founding and existence of the State of Israel. And I want us to see how significant it is that it is in our prayer book. And to understand the distinction between the Hebrew and the English as we start to move forward and look for a moment, just one moment, at the origin of the notion of the rock and Redeemer of Israel. We ready? Yes? So the rock and Redeemer of Israel, that language occurs in a number of different places in the Hebrew Bible, including many of the Psalms. Rock of Israel occurs in many of the Psalms, but it comes from one particular place that I really want to share with you today, and that is the book of Isaiah. And I want to talk to you for a moment about the place wherein it originates in the book of Isaiah, and that is Isaiah chapter 30. Now I want you to look at this. Now, for those of you who have the Hebrew Bibles there and you want to take a look and let me know what page number we're at, I would appreciate it, but you know, we can try to figure this out as we go. We're in chapter 30 of the book of Isaiah, which is one of the most fascinating moments that we look at that's going to kind of tie everything together for us. Page 678. Page 678. Take a look at what this says. And I'm going to talk about various elements of it. Unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of time, so I'm going to do this really briefly today, and then we're going to move on. Thus said God, the Holy One of Israel, you shall triumph by stillness and quiet. Your victory shall come about through calm and confidence. But you couldn't believe me. You couldn't hear me. You couldn't believe me. I told you everything was going to be okay. I told you to be steadfast. I told you to hold on to your faith. I told you not to panic, not to somehow abandon your faith. You couldn't hear me. You couldn't believe me, says God, right? Here is what is going to happen. Here is God's prophecy in the book of Isaiah. You will suffer poverty. I will afflict you with meager bread and scant water. And when you suffer lack, when you have no food, when there's only meager bread and only a little bit of water, when you suffer, suddenly you will listen to your teachers again. Then you will come back. Right? And then suddenly your eyes will watch your teacher, and whenever you deviate, whenever you do something that's wrong, you will listen. You will hear that voice of your teacher, and you will return to the right path. It will require a crisis. It will require a crisis that will affect you in your lives for you to come back. But it will happen. And you will come back, is the prophecy. Right? And then at that point, you will shed the idolatry. You will shed away those elements of your life that are not part of the plan. You will shed the things that are not core, that are not important. The silver and the gold that plate your idols, you will remove. You will throw them out. Look at the language of Isaiah. And then everything will change. Now, what is going to change? What, according to Isaiah, is going to happen? And when is it going to happen? And why is it going to happen? And what is Isaiah really talking about? Here we go. The bread that the ground brings shall suddenly become plentiful. There will be lots of rain. The land will become fertile. There will be lots of food. Even the livestock, even the animals are going to have plenty of food. The animals are now starving. The animals will have plenty of food. Everything will be plentiful. On high mountains and lofty hills, suddenly there will be streams. You will look outside and everything will be green. There will be plenty of water, which means everything is growing. God is taking care of us. Nature is replenishing itself. Everything will be wonderful for you after the meagerness of the bread, the lack of water that you've experienced. Suddenly, you will see a change that will occur in your lives. And at the same time, on a day of heavy slaughter, when towers topple, wait a minute, we're going to have plenty, and at the same time, the language of war? In the very same verses, the very same chapter of Isaiah, on the one hand plenty, on the other hand war, right? Look at what Isaiah is saying to us, right? And think about our lives. Think about what we're experiencing, right? The light of the moon will shine as brightly as the sun. And the sun will shine so brightly, it'll be sevenfold as bright as it is right now. Everything will be filled with light. It will be as if day and night are filled with light. Right? And God will come from afar at the same time in blazing wrath, in anger. Look at the distinction in the language, right? God's lips full of fury, God's tongue like devouring fire, God's breath like a raging torrent. What is going on here? On the one hand, peace and plenty and a wonderful life. And food for us and food for the animals and plenty of water and fertility. And on the other hand, anger and fury and war and fire and the toppling of towers. What? Look at this language. Look at this prophecy of Isaiah. And we have to ask ourselves, what is going on? What is happening here? What is he talking about? God will heal our injuries and wounds, the wounds that we have suffered, and at the same time, look at the violence that's associated with God, right? You see what I'm talking about? Yes? Do you see it in the text? Good. Reaching up, the waters will reach up to the neck to set a yoke upon nations and a bridle upon the jaws of peoples. In other words, God will suddenly subject other people to a yoke and to a bridle, right? And at the same time, for you, there shall be singing. This is verse by verse, side by side, all at the same time. Look at the kind of singing. As on a night when a festival is hallowed, there shall be rejoicing, like marching with a flute. Remarkable. Has anyone ever read Isaiah chapter 30? Are you familiar with one of the most complex, magnificent pieces of Hebrew writing ever produced? Yes? Okay. God will sound God's majestic voice and display the sweep of God's arm, and at the same time, raging wrath, devouring blaze of fire, tempest and rainstorm, and hailstones. What on earth is going on? What is Isaiah thinking? Can you make sense of it? Isn't it remarkable? Isn't it a remarkable piece of text? Yes? In the midst of this, where would we be marching? What is this festival going to be like? With the flute and the timbrels and the singing and the beautiful dancing. We're going to be dancing up as if to the mountain of God. The mountain of God, and it says to celebrate the rock of Israel. Tzur Yisrael, the same language we read in our liturgy. This is where it comes from. And while all of this is happening, and we are rejoicing, and we have plenty, and we have water, and we have food, and there's enough for everybody, and the animals, and everybody's celebrating, there is violence all around us. Do we understand it? Does this make any sense at all? Well, truly, Assyria, who beats with a rod, shall be cowed by the voice of God. Our victory, our success, our celebration, our plenty will be the defeat of whom? The Assyrian Empire that defeated the kingdom of Israel, that destroyed Samaria, that besieged Jerusalem, that destroyed the other cities of Judah. Right? And suddenly, Isaiah's prophecy makes sense. Because that notion of the rock of Israel and its protector, that very notion of redemption, is that very notion that occurs at the time of the composition of the Shema. In relation to precisely the crisis with Assyria. It all ties together. And what do we look for? Not only our redemption and our plentiful lives and our notion of everything being fertile and full of water and everything, but the destruction of Assyria. And Isaiah is talking about them at the very same time. War and destruction for our enemies and for the nations. And redemption and protection through the rock of Israel for us.
So those ideas continue today.
These ideas have continued to this very day. And to us, for us to this very day, this relates to the cyclical nature of our history. I want you to understand how powerful, how troubling, how painful, how difficult, how challenging, and in certain ways, I hate to say this, how true this is. How insightful this is about human nature and about so many of us seeking revenge and destruction and pain upon others in order for us to experience plenty, safety, protection, joy, and redemption. And this is what Isaiah captures. We are here among adults. We are here on a weekend wherein we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Resolution 181 that led to the creation of the State of Israel, and Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver's role in it. And I want to, for a moment, as we end this session, show you a clip of the seminal speech that Abba Hillel Silver delivered at the United Nations that led to that vote to establish the State of Israel. Because I don't know whether all of you have ever seen it, and if you haven't, you really must. So that's where we're going to go next, and we're only going to watch approximately 10 minutes of it, just under 10 minutes of it, okay? And we're going to start watching it now.
The Jewish Agency have indicated that it is now ready, through its authorized spokesman, a member of this delegation, to make the statement which they have been invited to make by a decision of the Assembly. I would suggest to the committee that it might be desirable to hear that statement now, if no member of the committee objects to that procedure. At the end of that statement, it may be that some member of the committee or members of the committee may wish to address oral questions to the representative of the Jewish Agency, to the spokesman of the Jewish Agency, on points arising out of that statement. And when those questions are dealt with, then the committee will proceed on its discussion of this item on the agenda. There are several members on the list to speak. If there's no objection, then we will ask the spokesman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine and his colleagues to take their place around the table.
Permit me at the outset to thank the Assembly of the United Nations for granting the Jewish Agency for Palestine a hearing on the question which is before this committee. We are grateful for the opportunity to take counsel with you in the matter of constituting and instructing a special committee of this body, which is to study the problem of Palestine and which is to bring in recommendations for the future government of that country. We trust that our participation in these deliberations will be helpful and will prove to be a contribution to the just solution of this grave international problem, which this international community is now earnestly seeking. Such a successful solution will prove a blessing not only to Palestine and all of its inhabitants, to the Jewish people, to the cause of world peace, but it will also enhance the moral authority and prestige of this great organization for world justice and peace, upon which so many high hopes of mankind now rest. to treat the Palestine problem as if it were one of merely reconciling the differences between two sections of the population presently inhabiting the country, or of finding a haven for a certain number of refugees and displaced persons, will only contribute to confusion. The mandate, in its preamble, recognizes the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the grounds for reconstituting, I call your attention to the word reconstituting, their national home in that country. These international commitments of a quarter of a century ago, which flowed from the recognition of historic rights and of present needs, and upon which so much has already been built in Palestine by the Jewish people, cannot now be erased. You cannot turn back the hands of the clock of history. Certainly the United Nations, guided by its great principle proclaimed in its charter, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, certainly the United Nations can never sanction the violation of treaties and of international law. It should, of course, be clear, and I regret that statements made by certain delegates in recent days have tended to confuse what should be clear, that when we speak of a Jewish state, we do not have in mind any racial state or any theocratic state, but one which will be based upon full equality and rights for all inhabitants without distinction of religion or race and without domination or subjugation. Your committee of inquiry will come to consider proposals for the future government of Palestine. This inescapable and irreducible factor, the international obligation to ensure the continuous development of the Jewish national home, should be kept, in our judgment, constantly in mind. I believe that the committee of inquiry should most certainly visit Palestine. Written documents are important, but infinitely more instructive are the living documents, the visible testimony of creative effort and achievement. In Palestine, they will see what the Jewish people, inspired by the hope of reconstituting their national home after the long, weary centuries of their homelessness, and relying upon the honor and the pledged word of the world community, has achieved in a few short years against great odds and seemingly insurmountable physical handicaps. The task was enormous. Untrained hands, inadequate means, overwhelming difficulties. The land was stripped and poor, neglected through the centuries. And the period of building took place between two disastrous world wars, when European Jewry was shattered and impoverished. Nevertheless, the record of pioneering achievement of the Jewish people in Palestine has received the acclaim of the entire world. And what was built there with social vision and high human idealism has proved a blessing, we believe, not only to the Jews of Palestine, but to the Arabs and to other non-Jewish communities as well. The Jewish people places great hope upon the outcome of the deliberations of this great body. It has faith in its collective sense of justice and fairness and in the high ideals which inspire it. We are an ancient people, and though we have often, on the long, hard road which we have traveled, been disillusioned, we have never been disheartened. We have never lost faith in the sovereignty and the ultimate triumph of great moral principles. The Jewish people belongs in this society of nations. Surely the Jewish people is no less deserving than other peoples whose national freedom and independence have been established and whose representatives are now seated here. The Jewish people were your allies in the war. and join their sacrifices to yours to achieve a common victory. We hope that that people, now rebuilding again its national life in its ancient homeland, will be welcomed before long by you to this noble fellowship of the United Nations.
Thank you, Dr. Silver.
We're going to cut this off here. I want to suggest to you, beyond anything else, that there is a straight line between the prophet Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, and the notion of history and cyclical history, and the speech of Abba Hillel Silver. And Abba Hillel Silver's demand that the community of nations recognize the historic right of the Jewish people to establish a state in Palestine. And I want to suggest to you that the terrible circumstances, that the poverty of means that Abba Hillel Silver refers to in the speech are the same lack, the same poor circumstances, the same conditions and means that Isaiah was talking about in certain ways during that time of Assyrian domination. And I want to suggest to you that Abba Hillel Silver's notion of the ongoing hope and faith of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people not losing hope while being disillusioned with the world, is part of the call of Isaiah for us to heed the voices of our teachers. And I want you to know that the speech is inspired by the texts that we have just read today. And that in this respect, the prayer for the state of Israel that's in Mishkan Tefillah is a reflection of the inspiration of Isaiah as it's reflected in the speech of Abba Hillel Silver. And I would be remiss if on this weekend of our Silver Scholar celebration, I didn't start our path in the exploration of redemption by introducing us to that prayer for the state of Israel and talking about that text from Isaiah in the speech of Abba Hillel Silver. That was what I wanted to bring to you today. So thank you for being with me for this.